All right, here we go. It is September 7th, 2022. It is iPhone 14 announcement day, and I'm excited to chat a little bit about what that means as a photographer. We've been anticipating it. If we've been looking at the iPhone rumor sites and the various Apple news forums, they've been talking about how we were going to get big camera upgrades, and it looks like that actually happened as expected. So that's a nice bonus. So welcome for those of you joining me as we get started here. Feel free to say hi in the chat. I'd love to see who's here, where you're from, how you heard about it, and all that fun stuff. And as an iPhone photographer, I'm pretty excited about what we're going to get with the new devices. All of a sudden, my iPhone 13 Pro is feeling pretty obsolete already, right? That's how that works. And so I'm going to be up at 5 a.m. on Friday morning Pacific time to be ordering the new iPhone 14 Pro because, hey, that's what you do when you're an Apple nerd in the photography world. So I was pretty excited to see, obviously the biggest news, I think, when it comes to the iPhone 14 devices and cameras is the sensor upgrade, the resolution of the sensor on the iPhone 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max. And I guess to just kind of set some context, so with the iPhone 14, there are 4 iPhone devices. There's a standard iPhone 14, there's an iPhone 14 Plus, which is a large size non-Pro phone. And then there's an iPhone 14 Pro and an iPhone 14 Pro Max. The Plus and the Pro Max are the same screen size, the 6.7 inches, whereas the Pro and just the regular iPhone 14, I believe, are both 6.1. I got to be honest, for my use, the added screen real estate doesn't strike me as that big of a bonus. I'd rather have the smaller size, fits easier in my pocket, easier to carry around. As long as I'm still getting all those same camera features, I'm going to be in the 14 Pro club as opposed to the Pro Max. But hey, to each their own. I'm glad that Apple offers those options for the people that like the bigger screen size. So with all of that context, as we look at, what are the options that Apple has given us to work with when it's time to choose which camera we're going to order or which camera that we're going to buy, because, for a lot of times, for a lot of iPhone photography purposes, I should say, the best cameras are going to come from the 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max. And so if you were serious about iPhone photography, I assume you're going to be going with one of those Pro cameras. Let's talk about that sensor upgrade in the Pro. As predicted, it's a 48 megapixel camera sensor, but, and I noted this in my reaction video that I posted earlier, which I'll drop a link up above here if you want to jump over to that. It's just a quick little 5-minute first thoughts reaction video I posted a couple hours earlier today. Apple is not a company that plays the stats game, right? They are not out there to show off their specs generally. They'd rather go with features, more benefits than features, right? They want to talk about what is it going to do for their average iPhone user? What is it going to do for the serious iPhone users? But they're going to talk about that and what can you get out of it, not what is the technology behind it, right? They talk about the technology, the Apple Silicon. They talk about their, their image signal processor, their image pipeline, but ultimately, it's not a specs and a stats game with Apple, which, do you love that or hate that? Let me know here in the comments. And with that, with that 48 megapixel sensor, we're thinking, sweet, we've got a big sensor. It's as big as, megapixel wise anyway. It's as many megapixels as a lot of the big Pro cameras. The reality is it's still a very small sensor. And what Apple's doing is they're making that 48 megapixel sensor available if you want to shoot in RAW. Apple's Pro RAW supports 48 megapixels now, straight off of the camera. I would expect that we're going to see third-party cameras that support RAW also do the same thing. I'm a big fan of Halide myself. Shout out to those guys. But for most normal operations, using the default camera app, unless you've gone to ProRAW, as I understand it, you're going to get a 12 megapixel finished image out of this. And the reason for that is because they're calling it a quad pixel sensor, but essentially for every 4 pixels that you've got in a grid on the sensor, in a 2x2 grid, it's going to take those and essentially merge those into one resulting picture. The result being that it lets in 4 times as much light onto that resulting pixel to give you much better low light performance, but the standard result is still a 12 megapixel photo. Now, if we're playing the megapixel war game, 12 megapixels isn't very many. If we're talking about what does it really mean for people's iPhone photography, 12 megapixels is plenty, right? That's plenty of megapixels to share your work on the web, on social media. Realistically, that's plenty of megapixels to make prints up to a pretty decent size, especially given the ability of the software that we now have to work with, where we can blow things up a little bit bigger without destroying the quality like we used to. And so I'm perfectly happy to have that new sensor in the iPhone 14 Pro camera. When I shoot in RAW, because I have a situation that demands it, I'm going to get that high resolution image. I can do a little bit more work in post-processing to really make that my own. But if I just need a quick snapshot, I can use the default camera app, I can use the default mode, and I can get a fantastic looking image at 12 megapixels that's going to be, I believe the stat I saw on the regular camera lens is about 2.5 times better low light performance than the iPhone 13 Pro. And this iPhone 13 Pro is not too shabby. It does pretty good. It holds its own. So I'm looking forward to those enhancements. You know, moving beyond just the camera sensor in the 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max, we've still got the same, not the same, but we still have the same number of other cameras on the device. It's got, the true depth camera on the front. This is at 12 megapixels now. Again, has low light improvements. They've moved the sensors around on the Pro models. They now have, I just blanked out on the term. What do they call it? Come on. The dynamic island, right? It's the kind of the pill-shaped cutout area at the top. It's replacing the notch that we knew and loved on the last couple of iPhones. But that dynamic island, that pill-shaped area where they have the camera sensors, where they have the microphone, or excuse me, the earpiece, the speaker, things like that, those are still there. We still have that camera. We also still have the same number of cameras on the back of the device. We have an ultra wide that'll let us go out to that, 0.5x view, as Apple refers to it. We still have the telephoto lens that goes to that 3x view, as Apple refers to it. I take a lot of photos with that telephoto lens. I mean, even if I wasn't really into photography, that might be the reason for me to go to the 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max to get that telephoto lens. But Apple did something interesting and new with the 14 Pro and Pro Max in that because it now has that 48 megapixel sensor, they now give us a 2x telephoto option in the camera app, which is using the main camera to make that 2x crop. And so instead of just the 3 options in the camera app, the super wide, the ultra wide, what they call the wide angle, the normal default camera view, and the 3x, we now also have a 2x. Hey there, Mark. Looking forward to combining them with the Profoto flashes. Yeah, and that's the thing is there are some fantastic accessories that are out there. In fact, I actually saw that Moment, who makes a lot of cases and accessory lenses and things like that for the iPhone. They've already announced their iPhone 14 cases are ready to go with their accessory system. In fact, I'm going to actually drop a link here into the chat so you can all see. And I will, full disclosure, this is an affiliate link. So if you do end up buying a Moment thing, I get a small commission from it. Moment iPhone 14 accessories. Drop that in the chat there so that you guys can all go take a look at that. The question is, how will the third-party lenses work with this? I'm going to be honest. I used to use third-party lenses on my iPhones. If we go back to, let's say, the iPhone 5, iPhone 6, iPhone 7 days, because I saw a lot of improvement with those. It let me get wider than I wanted to with the default link, or it let me zoom in a little bit more. But a couple things have happened where I now don't really use those as much. One is that Apple gave us the ultra wide lens. And so when I really want that wide angle shot, I can get it with a lens that's already built into the camera. The other thing that I've found is the editing software that we use, even the default algorithms and stuff like, Photoshop, the current version, but there's also image enhancement tools. Topaz Labs' Gigapixel AI is fantastic at expanding images. The super resolution zoom out of Lightroom let you zoom in and expand. Same thing in Photoshop. And so what I find is, instead of using another external lens when I want that extra telephoto reach, I'll use the built-in camera lens, and then I'll often make that crop, that enhancement, that expansion just in my editing software, because the software has gotten really darn good. And even for the systems like Moment System, where they have a nice lens system that you can add onto the camera, you still have to fiddle with it, right? You still have to bring it with you. You still have to, use their case, make sure that you've got your lenses with you. And, one of the big advantages of my iPhone is that usually when I go out for photography purposes, I'm not carrying a lot of extra stuff with me. So there's a question, thinking you should upgrade from an 11 to a 14. Apple's camera enhancements, they make nice enhancements every year. I mean, to the phone overall, yes, but to the camera system especially. I think the camera system is one of the areas where you definitely do see an enhancement every year. Year to year, those enhancements are, usually they're not revolutionary, right? They're evolutionary in that, it's a 20% improvement in something here. It's a 15% improvement in something there. Oh, this is, 20% faster, or things like that. And so year to year, I don't think everybody needs to go buy a new iPhone unless you're really into buying an iPhone for iPhoneography purposes, kind of a thing. When we start looking at over multiple generations, so between the iPhone 11 and now the 14, so we went from the 11, went to the 12, the 13, and now the 14. So we're talking about 3 generations of camera, 3 generations of smartphone here. And with those 3 generations, those enhancements start to add up. I was actually this past weekend talking to somebody I was camping with. They've got, I believe it's an iPhone 11, or it might even be I think it's an 11, and talking about, is it time for an upgrade for them, kind of a thing. And the reality is, if we say that, hey, let's say there's a 20% camera enhancement every year, well, those start compounding, right? And so 20%, and then 20% better than that 20%, and then 20% than that 20%. I mean, at some point, the math majors in the chat room can do that math for me, but we're like 50%, when you compound all that, or maybe it's the other way, maybe it's like 70%. And so those additions really start to add up. And so I would say, if photography is important to you on your smartphone, if you're, more than 2 generations ago behind, so like if you're in that iPhone 11 range, or maybe if you're still using an iPhone 10, I would say now is probably a good time to look at an upgrade. The good news is Apple did not increase the prices with this year's iPhone 14 Pro models. That was actually something that had been rumored. We'd been hearing that the prices were going to be going up. They still start at the same prices. I believe that's $999 for the iPhone 14 Pro and $1099 for the 14 Pro Max. If you want to go with just the standard iPhone model, I think that starts at $799, if I remember right. And so the good news is the prices haven't gone up. Now, I'm willing to admit that, hey, $1,000 starting price for an iPhone 14 Pro is not cheap, right? That's still a serious investment of cash. But, good photography equipment isn't cheap, right? Whether we're talking about a Sony mirrorless camera, a Profoto flash, good photo editing software from someone like, Adobe or Nik or Luminar or whoever it is. We spend money on our photography in different ways. And so if the iPhone is an important photography tool for you, it's probably worth that amount of money. Me personally, I'm on the Apple upgrade plan. So I get a new iPhone every year. I'm essentially leasing my phone from Apple. I pay, I think it's right about $50 US for my iPhone 13 Pro on that plan. Assuming I go with the iPhone 14 Pro, the equivalent model, my monthly cost won't change. I'll basically get my new phone. I'll send my old phone back to Apple. I'll keep paying them. And then in another year, when they announce the iPhone 15 or whatever comes next, I'll be able to upgrade to that. So I was excited to see that the cost has not gone up, even though we are getting some nice camera upgrades. One of the things that Apple talked about with their announcements, if we remember, I think it was about 2 years ago. They talked about Deep Fusion, and this was a name that they gave to essentially an image processing mode. It became known as sweater mode, jokingly, because during the announcement, they talked about how you could zoom in on, a sweater of somebody that they were wearing, and it really kept that detail, even in challenging light performance. This year they talked about essentially enhancements and evolutions of that. They're now using the term photonic engine to talk about their image pipeline, which is everything from the capture all the way down to the image processor that's part of the Apple silicon, a part of the Apple chips. The iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max do get a new chip. It's the A15 Bionic, and so it's the next evolution. It's the A16, I believe. That'd be the A16. Whereas the A15, which was last year's chip, the one that we have in the 13 Pro, is still going to be there in the iPhone 14 standard, not the non-Pro versions. So the Pro versions get an entirely new chip. The non-Pro versions are using the same chip as last year's Pro versions. Not too shabby, but again, if it's something that's really important to you, it's another tipping point in spending a little bit extra money and getting the Pro version. The demo images that they showed during the slideshow were interesting, and when this video goes up for replay, I'll drop in the description links to replay the Apple keynote event. You can jump to the iPhone photography stuff, which is later on in the program. But across the board, we're seeing great low light improvements with all of the cameras. Apple threw out terms like anywhere from 2 to 2.5x improvements in the low light performance. It's hard to know exactly how they're measuring those kinds of things. I found Apple isn't one that tends to fudge numbers, so they presumably have something. And again, what I've found with the iPhone cameras is if you're comparing year over year, so if I photograph something with my iPhone 13, photograph it again with the 14, you'll be able to tell a difference. But if I then also were to photograph something with a 12 or with an 11, you'd be able to tell a significant difference. And so I'm looking forward to those improvements. Mark mentioned in the chat that he's looking forward to trying it out with the Profoto flash units, which are fantastic. Profoto knows their lighting gear. Apple mentioned they made some improvements on the built-in flash on the iPhone. Now, I got to admit, I probably use this on less than 1% of the photos I ever take, but every once in a while I need some light. One of the improvements that they made that they called out was that the flash is now, basically it's adaptive, and that it will take into consideration the focal length and the focus distance that's being used for the image when it's deciding how much light to put out there. It can put out, I believe as I understand it, twice as bright of light as needed, but that's going to be adaptive based on what it thinks the scene needs. And so when you do need that extra light, hopefully you can get that at a reasonable level where you don't kind of get that blown out deer in the headlights, bright white flash look. Feel free to drop any questions into the chat that you've got around what got announced today or what didn't get announced today. When it comes to availability, Apple is saying pre-orders will start on Friday, the 9th. Starting at 5 a.m. Pacific time, which means that's super convenient for those of you on the East Coast. For those of us on the West Coast, I'm going to be setting a really early alarm that morning to try and make sure I get my iPhone order in for day one. And for the Pro models, those are expected to ship and be available a week later. So I believe that's the 16th would be the delivery date for those. For the non-Pro models, just the standard iPhone, they're going to be available for order on Friday as well. The standard iPhone 14 should be available on the 16th as well. The Plus model, so this is the new bigger non-Pro phone, is not expected to be available until October 7th. Given the world's supply chain issues in late 2022, I was kind of curious to see what availability would look like on the new Apple products. I did note when they were announcing, I believe it was the Apple Watches earlier in the announcements today, that some of those Apple Watches had delayed availability as well. Apple, headed up by Tim Cook, who's kind of the king of supply chain logistics and things like that. Even Apple is having challenges with their supply chain, and so I'm not surprised to see slightly delayed availability for some of the products. One of the other things that I think is kind of interesting is they have something called action mode now. And essentially what this is this is video camera stability on steroids. I was listening to a podcast, I think it was, or watching a video a couple months ago, and David Sparks from Mac Power Users, he and his wife have got a little project where they're doing just kind of an informal Disneyland YouTube channel. I'll drop a link in the description when this goes up for replay so you can go over and check that out. But David is a Mac nerd. He's an Apple nerd. He hosts the Mac Power Users podcast, and he was talking about how he has a really nice Sony camera that he bought for the purpose of doing videography at Disneyland for this YouTube channel. But what he found was the hassle of the size of the camera and bringing the gimbal with him for stabilization and all that kind of things. He found that the stabilization on the iPhone 13 Pro was good enough for his purposes and so much easier to use. Well, this action mode, which is coming with the iPhone 14 Pro, is even better than that from stabilization purposes. The Apple keynote shows some examples of someone doing some trail running, I believe it was, and it is significantly different. It's significantly smoother. And this is all a result of that Apple Silicon, that image signal processor, and those capabilities existing on the device to be able to perform that stabilization without having to carry a gimbal. Maybe this is kind of a recurring theme. We talked about it when we talked about the external lenses. We're talking about it now with carrying a gimbal for stabilization. The more capabilities that Apple and the other smartphone manufacturers build into these devices, the less external pieces, parts, accessories we need to carry with us. Nobody's choosing to use their smartphone for photography because they want to carry a whole bunch of extra stuff, right? If I wanted to carry a backpack full or a suitcase full of camera gear, I've got suitcases, and I've got suitcases full of camera gear, right? I mean, when I go do professional event photography, I bring a bunch of crap with me. But when I take my iPhone out, and if I'm just going on a family trip, or, we went camping this last weekend up at a lake, I didn't bring all that camera gear. I had my iPhone to take some pictures as I wanted to, but I didn't need to bring all that additional stuff. And the more capabilities we can get without all that additional stuff, the better it is for us as photographers, whether we're pros or whether we're serious hobbyists. Apple wants to make it accessible and possible for everyone. So again, if there's any last questions, drop them in. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up here, I think, in a couple minutes. Keep this nice and tight. I was excited to see the new bigger sensor in the iPhone 14 Pro cameras come out. I was excited to see the price stay the same. They did announce this year's new kind of flagship color available both on the Pro models and in the standard iPhone is a purple color. That's a slightly different color for each. I believe they called it a deep purple for the iPhone Pro. And so if you want to get a purple iPhone, there's another reason you can upgrade, depending on what your reasons are and who you want to convince that it's worth spending the money, whether that's yourself or a family member or your photography business. So it's been fun. I'm excited to order my iPhone 14 Pro. I'm excited to get it here, hopefully in about a week and a half. I'll certainly be talking about it here. So, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel to get those updates when that happens. And, I'll also, if you want to head over to techphotoguy.com, you can subscribe to my email list there. Get things dropped into your inbox every week about modern tech photo stuff. And so with all of that, thanks for being here. Thanks for those of you who chimed in the chat. I'll be back with some more cool photography stuff soon. And until then, get out there, make some fun photos. Take care.